It was 8 houses from her front door. Not 8 blocks, not 8 miles, 8 houses. 60 seconds of walking on a street she had crossed 100 times before. That is the distance between a normal Thursday afternoon and a nightmare that would last 30 years. Angie Housman never made it home. St. Anne, Missouri was the kind of place where parents did not worry. Not really. It sat in the northwest corner of St. Louis County, just a few miles from the airport, a quiet suburb where kids rode bikes after school and neighbors knew each other's names. Crime was low. Children walked home from the bus stop alone because nothing bad ever happened here. That belief was about to be destroyed forever. Angie Marie Housman was 9 years old. She had blue eyes, brown hair, and a smile that people say could fill a room before she even opened her mouth. Her neighbors called her happy-go-lucky. Her teachers said she was popular. Her friends said she was the kind of kid who walked up to strangers and made them feel like old friends in 5 minutes. She had big plans for her life, not the kind most 9-year-olds talk about. It was not dreaming about being a pop star or a famous athlete. Angie wanted to be a nurse's aide. She wanted to take care of people. At 9 years old, she had already decided that helping others was what her life was going to be about. At home on Wright Avenue, she shared a duplex with her mother Diane, her stepfather Ron, and her 2-year-old half-brother Ronnie. A year before she disappeared, Angie won a $500 shopping spree at a local toy store. She picked one thing for herself, a pink bicycle with a radio built into the handlebars. Then she told the people running the contest to give the rest of the money to kids who needed it more. That was Angie. There was a rose bush just outside the house on Wright Avenue. Angie and her mother had planted it together 2 years earlier in memory of an uncle who had passed away. It was a small, quiet thing, a girl and her mother pressing roots into cold Missouri dirt, not knowing that one day that rose bush would outlive Angie. And eventually it would outlive Diane too. But on November 18, 1993, none of that wait existed yet. It was just a Thursday. Angie got off the school bus at around 4 in the afternoon. The stop was at the corner of Wright Avenue and St. Gregory Lane, half a block, 8 houses from her front door. She was wearing a light pink coat. Her blue and white book bag hung from her shoulders. One specific item she was wearing that day was a piece of pink children's clothing with a distinct dark band, a detail that seemed ordinary but would later become the key to the entire case. She did this walk every single day. She knew every crack in the sidewalk. There was a woman on the street who had a quiet habit of watching the neighborhood children walk home from the bus. Not official, not organized, just a neighbor keeping an eye out, the way people did in St. Anne. But on November 18th, she was not there. She was taking care of a sick relative. Another neighbor who sometimes watched from her porch was also unavailable that day. 2 small absences, 2 quiet gaps in the safety net that this street had built without anyone ever writing it down. Did someone know the neighbor was away? Or were they simply waiting for that 1-minute window when the street went completely silent? Angie's classmates walked with her for part of the route. They watched her pass the 4th house. After that, she was alone. After that, nobody saw a single thing. No scream, no struggle, no sound at all. She was there, and then she was not. Inside the duplex, Diane was napping with 2-year-old Ronnie, waiting for the sound she heard every afternoon. The front door, the footsteps, the heavy drop of a backpack hitting the floor. That sound never came. When Ron's truck pulled into the driveway at 5 o'clock, the silence in the house told him everything. No Angie, no bag, no sign that she had ever walked through the door. At first, they did what most parents do. They told themselves there was an explanation. Maybe she stopped to talk to a friend. Maybe she lost track of time. But as the minutes stretched past 30, past 45, the air inside that duplex changed. Ron and Diane went outside. They walked the route. They called her name. Neighbors came out and joined them. They knocked on doors. They checked every yard on the block. Nothing. At 7:10 in the evening, they called the police. Officers arrived and understood immediately that this was not a child who had wandered off. It was cold. It was getting dark. K-9 units were called in that same night. The dogs picked up Angie's scent at the bus stop. They followed it down Wright Avenue, pulling hard, nose to the ground. The trail was clear. For a brief moment, it seemed like this would end quickly. Then, about halfway between the bus stop and her house, the dogs stopped. Not slowed, not confused, stopped. The K-9s didn't circle in confusion. They sat down, right there in the middle of the sidewalk, between 2 yellow porch lights, and the trail simply ended. It wasn't a fade, it was a cliff. Sergeant Jim Mantle told a reporter the next day she couldn't just vanish. We don't know what happened. But the dogs knew something. The scent did not drift away or grow faint. It was cut off, clean, in the middle of a residential street. The most likely explanation was the one nobody wanted to say out loud yet, that somewhere on that stretch of Wright Avenue, a vehicle had been waiting, that Angie had been inside it before the neighborhood even noticed she was missing. Helicopters swept low over nearby parks and creek banks with infrared sensors. They found nothing. The parks were empty. The creek banks were quiet. Angie Housman had been missing for less than 3 hours. The trail was already gone. The scent just stopped. Like she had been lifted off the ground and carried away. Because she had. By the next morning, Angie Housman's face was everywhere, on television screens, on telephone poles, on the front page of every newspaper in St. Louis. In less than 12 hours, a missing 9-year-old girl from a quiet suburb had become the only thing anyone in the city was talking about, and the police were already scared. The St. Anne Police Department did not handle this alone. Within the first day, they pulled in the Major Case Squad of Greater St. Louis, a specialized unit built for exactly this kind of case, made up of officers from multiple departments across the region. The FBI joined shortly after. More than 20 additional officers were assigned. Every ditch, every abandoned shed, and every inch of the Missouri brush was turned over. In the first 24 hours alone, the tip line received over 300 calls. 300 people who thought they had seen something, heard something, knew something. Detectives worked through every single one, and every single one went nowhere. Robert Lowry Jr., who commanded the Major Case Squad, later told reporters, "A little girl gets off the school bus and she's 100 feet from her house and she disappears into the silence of a Thursday afternoon. I don't understand it. Neither did anyone else. But there was something that made this case even more urgent, something that had happened just 10 days before Angie vanished, and something the police had not forgotten. On November 8th, in nearby Maryland Heights, an 11-year-old girl got off her school bus and started walking home. A man approached her. He grabbed her and tried to drag her into the bushes. She fought back, broke free, and ran. She survived, and she gave police a description. Similar age to Angie. Same method, school bus, same time of day, same type of quiet residential street. A composite sketch was drawn up and distributed across the region. But here is what made investigators uneasy. That man had not attacked a child out of impulse. He had positioned himself near a school bus stop at the exact moment children would be walking home alone. He had chosen his location, he had chosen his timing, he had chosen his target. In 1993, justice relied on the blurry memory of an 11-year-old and a charcoal pencil. No cameras, no footage, no digital trail. And that man, the one from the sketch, was still out there, watching the same news everyone else was watching. Was Angie's disappearance his second attempt? Detectives could not confirm it, but they could not dismiss it either. Meanwhile, the family was breaking in the way families do, quietly, behind closed doors, where no cameras could reach. Ron went back to work because he did not know what else to do with his hands. But a wrench feels different when you are wondering if those same hands should have been holding your daughter's hand at 4 o'clock. His coworkers later said he would stop mid-job and punch the wall, not out of rage at any one person, just because standing still meant feeling everything at once. Diane was worse. She could not look out the window. The street, the same ordinary street where Angie had walked home 100 times, had become something unbearable. She started keeping the curtains closed. Every time she caught a glimpse of the bus stop, she broke down completely. The house that had always been full of noise was now just quiet in a way that felt like a wound. Investigators looked at Ron early, the way they always look at the people closest to a missing child. He agreed to a polygraph without hesitation. He passed. He told detectives, "Stop wasting time on me and go find her." They also tracked down Angie's biological father, Angelo DeAndrea, a man who had never been part of Angie's life, yet apparently could not stay away from it. According to Diane, he had driven past the house on Wright Avenue multiple times over the years, watching Angie play outside from the safety of his car window. He never introduced himself, never spoke to her. It was a child he watched like a movie from his driver's seat. Present enough to observe, distant enough to deny. It was unsettling, yes, but was it murder? His alibi was airtight. He had not been near St. Anne on November 18th, another door that opened onto nothing. Then, a few days into the investigation, a detail surfaced that changed the shape of everything. One of Angie's teachers came forward. In the days before she disappeared, Angie had mentioned something at school, casually, the way children mention things that seem ordinary to them. She told her teacher she was going on a nature trip soon with her uncle. Detectives went back to the family immediately. They asked about the uncle. There was no uncle. Angie did not have an uncle who took her on nature trips. Ron and Diane had no idea what she was talking about. No family member, no family friend, no one in Angie's life fit that description. So who had she been talking about? In the world of a 9-year-old, uncle is not just a title. It is a shield. It means this person had not just grabbed her. They had groomed her. They had not just taken her body. They had stolen her caution first. Someone had spent time with Angie, earned her comfort, given himself a warm, familiar name, and made her believe a nature trip was something to look forward to. That takes weeks, maybe longer. It does not happen in an afternoon, which meant this was not random. Someone had watched Angie's routine, learned her schedule, chosen her. And the most terrifying part was this: she had never felt afraid. She had gone to school and told her teacher about the trip like it was something exciting. She trusted him. But no name came with the word uncle, no face. No one in Angie's life could point to a man she had been spending extra time with. The nature trip existed in one sentence spoken to a teacher and nowhere else. Days passed. The tip line kept ringing. Every lead collapsed the moment detectives touched it. The composite sketch was shown across the region. A man in a blue sedan had been spotted driving slowly through the neighborhood. His description matched the sketch. Thousands of flyers went out. His identity never surfaced. 1 week passed. 9 days after Angie Housman stepped off that school bus on a cold gray morning in St. Charles County, 2 deer hunters walked into the Bush Wildlife Conservation Area. Dry leaves crunched under their boots. The Missouri sky sat low and heavy. They were looking for game. They were not looking for a little girl, but they found one. What they found tied to that tree would break the heart of an entire city. The hunters almost walked past her. She was within earshot of passing cars, 50 feet from the road in the Bush Wildlife Conservation Area in St. Charles County. The trees all looked the same in the gray morning light of November 27th. The brush was thick, the ground was frozen. They were looking up, scanning the branches for movement. Then one of them looked down. Lieutenant Ed Copeland was among the first officers on the scene. He said later, "It was cold, cloudy, just a dreary day. I saw a young child's body in the woods. It was very shocking. I pretty much knew who it was." Everyone knew who it was. Angie had been missing for 9 days. Every officer in Missouri had her face memorized. And now she was here, a stone's throw from the pavement, in a patch of woods that people drove past every single day without a second glance. Near her body, investigators found plastic bags. Inside them, a light pink coat, tennis shoes, red socks, a t-shirt, and school books, their pages still intact, with a name written carefully on the covers: Angie Housman. She had carried those books on her back on the afternoon of November 18th. Now they were sitting in the frozen dirt of a wildlife area 20 miles from her home. That careful, childlike handwriting on the cover of a school book, the kind of thing a 9-year-old does on the first day of school, was now evidence in a murder investigation. What the scene told investigators, piece by piece, was far worse than a child who had simply been abandoned in the woods. She had been brought here less than 24 hours before she was found, which meant that for over 200 hours before this moment, she had been somewhere else, alive. And whoever had taken her had made a final, deliberate choice to bring her to these woods only at the very end. She had been restrained. She had been found in a state of forced restraint, secured with metal hardware, a chilling scene that spoke to the gravity of the crime. She had been heavily immobilized with adhesive tape, a deliberate act to ensure her silence and prevent any chance of escape. She could breathe. That was the only mercy, and it was not mercy at all. The frozen dirt at the base of that tree held the only record of her final hours. Back and forth, uneven, desperate marks in the soil, and mud caked on the bottoms of her bare feet. She had been walked into those woods without shoes, and those marks were not just signs of a struggle. They were the footprints of a 9-year-old girl who refused to give up until the very end. She did not get free. The autopsy confirmed what the scene had already begun to say. During over a week of darkness, Angie had been given almost no food and almost no water. Her body, by the time the hunters found her, carried the full weight of what had been done to her across those 9 days. Investigators found signs of physical trauma on her body. These injuries had been covered with tape, a chilling indication that her captor intended to prolong her ordeal. Her hair had been cut short. Its color had been changed. These were not accidents. They were decisions made calmly over multiple days by someone who was thinking clearly the entire time. And then, at the end, That same someone had walked her barefoot into freezing Missouri woods in late November, tied her to a tree, and left. The official cause of death was hypothermia. The forest was freezing that night, well below zero. But the coldest thing in those woods was not the air. It was the heart of the man who walked away while she was still breathing. Ice chips had collected on her shoulders and in her hair by the time the hunters found her. He had been alive when he left. The evidence made that absolutely clear. He had not ended it. He had simply walked away into the dark and let the cold do the rest. Attorney Tim Lamar, who would later prosecute this case, said she struggled extensively to free herself before she ultimately perished, 9 years old, and she fought until she had nothing left. Forensic teams processed every inch of that scene. Over 150 pieces of evidence were collected. Among everything gathered, 2 things stood apart. The first was a DNA sample, biological material that could one day identify whoever did this. In 1993, the technology to fully analyze it did not yet exist in a way that would hold up in court. The second was a fingerprint. Lifted from the adhesive side of the duct tape, the side that had been pressed against her face, it was partial, not enough to run through the national database, but enough to compare against a suspect if the right person was ever found. A killer's identity was sitting in a cardboard box, trapped in a partial smudge of oil and skin. It was right there in that evidence room on that shelf, but the world was not yet ready to read it. That fingerprint would wait for 25 years. 4 days after Angie's body was found, St. Louis was hit again. On December 1st, 10-year-old Cassidy Center disappeared in Bridgeton, 10 miles from St. Anne. She had been walking to a friend's house to put up Christmas decorations. She had a personal protection alarm clipped to her coat. A neighbor heard its sound and rushed outside. The device was lying on the ground by the road. Cassidy was gone. Parents across St. Louis stopped letting their children outside. Schools held emergency meetings. The city settled into the kind of fear that does not announce itself loudly. It just lives behind every closed curtain and every porch light left burning through the night. But when Cassidy's body was found 8 days later, and when detectives closed in on her killer, a man named Thomas Brooks, who had taken her into the basement of a house near her friend's home, something became sharply clear. Thomas Brooks had nothing to do with Angie Housman. The crimes looked identical from the outside. Same city, same month, same age range, but the evidence pulled in completely different directions. There was no single predator haunting the suburbs of St. Louis that winter. There were 2, in the same month, in the same city. And the one who had taken Angie was still completely invisible. A killer's fingerprint sat in a cardboard box in an evidence room. A DNA sample sat alongside it. And somewhere out there, a man was going about his life as though nothing had happened. That box would stay closed for a very long time. Every case here starts with a name and weeks of late nights making sure we get it right. If this story moved you, like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which part hit you hardest. And more mysterious solved cold cases are waiting for you in the description below. Now, let's back to the case. The weeks after Angie's funeral turned into months. The months turned into years, and the case that had gripped an entire city slowly, quietly, began to go cold. Not because the police stopped caring, not because the family stopped hurting, but because every road led to the same place, a brick wall with no door and no way through. This is what 25 years of silence looks like up close. The first real suspect came from the composite sketch. After Angie vanished, investigators had distributed the drawing of the man who had attacked the 11-year-old girl in Maryland Heights 10 days earlier. Same method, same type of neighborhood, same time of day. The sketch ran on television, in newspapers, on thousands of flyers across St. Louis. Someone recognized it. His name was Gary Stufflebean, 37 years old, from Houston, Texas. He had been in the St. Louis area in early November for work and family visits. His description matched the sketch closely enough that detectives moved fast. They brought him in. They searched his Texas home. They looked hard at everything connected to him. For a moment, it felt like this was it. Then his employer produced records. Gary Stufflebean had not been anywhere near St. Louis on the day Angie disappeared. His alibi was solid, documented, and impossible to argue with. He was cleared of both murders, though he would later face consequences for a separate attack. He had not touched Angie Housman. One more door, one more silent corridor. In 1994, detectives traveled to Florida to look at a man named John Wayne Parsons. He had been caught at a Tampa film processing center developing photographs of children that had no business being developed. When police searched his home, they found a newspaper clipping about Angie's murder, carefully kept, alongside evidence tying him to St. Louis. Robert Lowry told the press, "This is the best suspect we have. Hair samples, blood samples, everything sent to the FBI lab." Detectives waited months. No match. Parsons had collected that clipping the way some disturbed people collect news stories about crimes they wish they had committed. But he had not committed this one. Another brick wall. Technology changed. DNA science was born, grew, and began solving cases that had seemed impossible. But inside the evidence room, the box labeled Housman just grew thicker and dustier. The world moved on. New crimes demanded attention. New cases filled the tip lines. But for Ron and Diane Bone, it was always November 18th. By 2001, the case had been sitting untouched for 8 years. The original reward had expired. Then a businessman in the community donated $250,000, one of the largest private rewards in Missouri history, for information leading to Angie's killer. The tip line exploded overnight. Suddenly, everyone had a story to tell. But justice cannot be bought with rumors. And the man at the center of this case did not have a price tag on him. Every call was followed up, every claim was checked, and every single one dissolved into nothing the moment investigators looked closely. Then came Corey Fox. Fox was already in prison when he picked up the phone and confessed to killing Angie Housman. He was a convicted murderer. He had killed a coworker, then later killed his own cellmate. He was not a stranger to violence, and when detectives arrived to interview him, he told a detailed story. He and a friend named Virgil, he said, had taken Angie together. They had kept her captive for days, originally planning to demand ransom. When they realized she could identify them, they took her to the woods and left her there. He knew things, real things, details about the tree, details about how she had been silenced, details that had never been made public. Detectives leaned forward. This felt different. Then they asked him about the handcuffs. "Plastic," Fox said. "Toy handcuffs. The cheap kind you find in a costume shop." The handcuffs had been metal. Heavy, real, police-grade metal. That detail had never been released to the press. Fox had gotten it wrong because he had never been there. More cracks appeared when investigators pressed further. He described Angie's clothing incorrectly. The accomplice named Virgil could not be located because Virgil did not exist. Fox had built an entire confession out of newspaper clippings and television coverage, then filled the gaps with pure invention. There is a specific kind of person who orbits high-profile murder cases, someone who craves the attention that comes with being at the center of something enormous. Fox was already serving life in prison. A false confession cost him nothing. It gave him something he clearly wanted. Detectives flying in, notepads open, treating his words like they mattered. He had memorized the public details and bet that hope would fill in the rest. It did not. Corey Fox was eliminated. Virgil had never existed. And the real killer remained completely untouched. Then came Roger Martin. In 2007, a new detective team reviewing the old case files found something that had been sitting in the records for 14 years. On the morning Angie's body was discovered, a man had been parked on the side of the road near the Bush Wildlife Area, just sitting in his truck, watching as police cordoned off the scene. Officers had spoken to him at the time. He said he was deer hunting. He had no hunting equipment. His name was Roger Martin. When detectives pulled his background, they found a history of offenses against children. One of those offenses had taken place in the same woods where Angie's body was found. He had been there before, and on the morning her body was discovered, he had come back. Detectives brought him in. He denied everything. He said he had never seen Angie's face before in his life. But every time an investigator placed her photograph on the table in front of him, he turned it over immediately, face down, every single time. He could not look at her. He submitted to a voice stress test. It indicated deception. He claimed he had been at work on November 18, 1993. Investigators checked. He had not been at work that day. The alibi was a lie. After 14 years of nothing, this felt like solid ground. The truck parked near the crime scene. The prior offenses in the same location, the lie about the alibi, the photographs he refused to face. Then the fingerprint results came back. Roger Martin's prints did not match the partial print lifted from the adhesive side of the duct tape on Angie's face. He was released. And the investigation, once again, had nothing left to stand on. The anniversary of the silence came and went. Year after year, Ron Bone grew older, Diane grew quieter. The pink bicycle sat rusting in the shed. The curtains on the window stayed closed, but 3 women in the St. Louis community refused to accept that this was how the story ended. They called themselves Angie's Angels for Justice. They spent their own evenings, their own weekends, their own money going through documents, knocking on doors, keeping pressure alive. They had boxes full of research. They had years of their lives invested in a case the system had quietly moved past. Their persistence eventually pushed the St. Charles County Police Department to form a new, dedicated task force in 2018, 25 years after Angie's murder, with fresh investigators, modern tools, and one specific goal. The new team opened those old boxes. They did not look for new suspects. They looked at the evidence that had been sitting in the dark for a quarter of a century, and they realized something that changed everything. The answer had been there all along. Everything came back to that specific piece of children's clothing found at the scene. This fabric, preserved for 25 years, had been used to ensure her silence during the abduction. The 2018 task force came in with fresh eyes and one simple mandate: go back to the beginning. Lieutenant Ed Copeland and Lieutenant Colonel John Langford pulled the dusty archives of a cold case out of storage. Inside those cardboard coffins of 25 years, the pink coat, the school books, the handcuffs, the duct tape, and the underwear. The task force sent everything to the forensic lab with one question: what can modern technology find that 1993 could not? The duct tape had disintegrated inside the box over the decades. It had simply fallen apart, taking whatever it still held with it. The handcuffs were covered almost entirely in Angie's blood, too compromised to yield a clean foreign sample. That left the underwear. This fabric had been used as a tool of silence during her abduction, preserved in an evidence bag for 25 years. On every logical level, it seemed like the least promising item in the box. If the duct tape had crumbled and the handcuffs were compromised, what could possibly survive on a small piece of fabric that had been through all of that? But investigators sent it anyway, because it was all they had left. Here is what had changed between 1993 and 2017. For years, the specific dyes used in children's clothing had acted as a chemical barrier, an inhibitor that made it nearly impossible to extract a reliable DNA profile from fabric without destroying the sample in the process. Every time a test was performed, it consumed part of the evidence. One chance, inconsistent results, not enough to hold up in court. Investigators had known this. They had deliberately waited, not out of carelessness, but out of precision. They were holding the last bullet and waiting for a weapon accurate enough to fire it. In 2017, that weapon finally existed. A specific advancement eliminated the dye inhibitor problem entirely. Fabric could now be tested without destroying it. In early 2019, a St. Angie, Charles County forensic scientist sat down with that piece of underwear and went to work. What she found was approximately the size of a pea. A trace of DNA so small it could fit on the tip of a finger, yet heavy enough to crush a man's life 25 years later. On the dark pink band at the top of that underwear, surviving against every reasonable expectation, a male DNA profile was still there. It went into CODIS immediately. The match came back the same day. His name was Earl Webster Cox. While detectives had chased Gary Stufflebean to Texas, while they had flown to Florida for John Wayne Parsons, while they had watched Roger Martin turn Angie's photographs face down on an interrogation table, Earl Webster Cox had been right there, not nearby, not in the general area, 3 blocks from Angie's front door. At the time of her abduction, Cox was living on Wismer Avenue in Breckenridge Hills. A St. Louis County speeding ticket placed him there precisely 3 blocks from the duplex on Wright Avenue where Angie lived with her family. His sister lived even closer, 3 houses east of Booter Elementary, the school Angie walked into every single morning. He was not a stranger hiding in the shadows. He was a neighbor. Someone a 9-year-old might see at the park, or pass on the sidewalk, or wave at from a bicycle. Someone she might eventually feel comfortable enough to call Uncle. 4 years after Angie's murder, the FBI compiled a list of known sex offenders in the St. Louis area. Earl Webster Cox's name was on it. He was never questioned, not once. His name was on the list. The list was in the building. The building was in the same city where Angie's case file sat unsolved on a shelf. But in 1997, a name without a DNA match was just ink on paper. You could not arrest a man for living near a crime scene. Justice was waiting for the world to catch up, but here is what that explanation does not ease. Here is the part that stays with you. In 1989, 4 years before Angie was taken, Cox had been arrested for assaulting 2 young girls at Mort Jacobs Park, the park sitting immediately south of Booter Elementary, Angie's school. He had committed crimes against children in the shadow of her classroom. The charges were dropped, his parole was revoked, he served time, and then in December 1992, 11 months before Angie disappeared, he walked out of Fort Leavenworth and moved back to St. Anne. 11 months. Then Angie was gone. Cox's history did not begin and end with one neighborhood. By 1997, he had become part of an international criminal network involved in the distribution of illegal and exploitative materials featuring minors. In 2002, an undercover FBI agent posing as a 14-year-old girl made contact with him online. Cox sent her money for a bus ticket. He showed up at the meeting point expecting a child. He found federal agents instead. When they seized his computer, they found over 45,000 images. His arrest led to 60 more across 11 countries, one of the largest operations of its kind in American history. He was sentenced to 10 years. When that sentence ended in 2011, a federal judge refused to release him, declaring him a sexually dangerous person under the Adam Walsh Act, and he had been held at the Butner Federal Correctional Complex in North Carolina ever since. He thought the worst was behind him. He thought the one crime nobody had ever connected to him was buried deep enough to stay buried. A pea-sized trace of DNA on a pink waistband said otherwise. Detectives traveled to North Carolina. They sat down across from Earl Webster Cox, 61 years old, federal prisoner, convicted predator, and told him what they had found. He looked at them and said, "I'm not talking." It did not matter. The DNA probability was 1 in 58.1 trillion. There are roughly 7.5 billion people on Earth. That number does not leave room for coincidence, for error, or for silence. It leaves room for exactly one person. On June 5, 2019, 25 years, 6 months, and 18 days after Angie stepped off that school bus, Earl Webster Cox was charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and felony criminal sexual conduct. The ghost had a name. The name had an address. And for the first time in 25 years, that address was a jail cell. On August 20, 2020, Earl Webster Cox was brought into a St. Charles County courtroom. He did not look like a monster. He looked like a sick old man. He had lost weight since his arrest photograph. His skin had the gray, papery look of someone who had spent decades indoors. He looked well past his 63 years, closer to 90 than 60, one reporter noted. When Judge John Cunningham asked him questions, Cox answered mostly in 2 words, "Yes, sir." For 1 hour and 40 minutes, that was almost all he said. The man who had taken a 9-year-old girl and held her for 9 days. The man who had walked away from a tree in the freezing Missouri woods while she was still breathing. That man sat in a courtroom chair and answered questions in the voice of someone who had already given up. He pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and child molestation. In exchange, the death penalty was taken off the table. Judge Cunningham sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. It was the right sentence. It came 27 years too late. Before the sentence was handed down, 5 people stood up to speak. Ron Bone Sr. was first. Angie's stepfather, the man who had come home from work on November 18, 1993, and found a silent house, stood in that courtroom and said what he had been carrying for nearly 3 decades. He talked about Diane, about what losing Angie had done to her, about the woman she had been before and the woman she became after. She died of a broken heart, he told the court. Long before the cancer ever touched her, Diane Bone's story deserves to be told fully because it is not separate from Angie's case. It is part of it. After Angie was found in those woods, Diane closed the curtains on the window that faced Wright Avenue. She could not look at the street. She could not look at the bus stop. Every time she caught a glimpse of that ordinary stretch of road, something inside her broke open again. So she kept the curtains closed, day and night. For years, she left the porch light on every evening. Not as a ritual, not as a symbol, just because turning it off felt like giving up, like admitting that Angie was never coming back. The light stayed on for years after they moved, well into their new home on Harold Drive in Woodson Terrace in 1999. Around 1998, 5 years after Angie's death, Diane tried to take her own life. She was found by her young son Ronnie, who was 7 years old. He looked at his mother and said, "If you kill yourself, I'll never love you again." She stopped. She stayed. But the weight never lifted. A job at Motel 6 helped, in the small practical way that having somewhere to be every morning helps people survive grief. It got her out of the house. It gave her hours where her mind had to focus on something else. It was not healing. It was just surviving. She fought cancer with the same stubbornness. Her obituary said that when she received her diagnosis, 22 years after losing Angie, she chose to fight. She did not give up. She was described as a true role model. Diane Bone died in November 2016. She was 52 years old. She never knew who took her daughter. Ron still has the bicycle. It is in a shed behind his house in Woodson Terrace. The pink bicycle with the radio on the handlebars. The one Angie won at Northwest Plaza when she was 7 years old. The one she chose for herself out of a $500 shopping spree and then told them to give the rest away. It is rusted now. The radio no longer works. But Ron has never been able to throw it out. Some things you keep not because they are useful. You keep them because letting go feels like losing the person twice. On Wright Avenue, the rose bush that Angie and Diane planted together in 1991 is still there. Angie is buried at Laurel Hill Memorial Gardens. Her uncle, whose memory that rose bush was planted for, is buried nearby, and now Diane is buried near them both. 3 people connected by love and loss, together in the ground while the rose bush on Wright Avenue keeps growing. The courtroom was not the end of Earl Cox's legal reckoning. In March 2021, Cox entered an Alford plea to 4 counts of felony assault, addressing grave offenses committed against a young child decades earlier at his home on Wismar Road and in a car at a park in Overland. The same crimes that had been charged and dropped decades earlier. The victim was now an adult. She had waited 30 years for this moment. She addressed Cox directly through a video conference feed. She did not cry. She did not plead. She looked at the man who had harmed her as a child and she said the words she had been building toward for 3 decades. You will rot in a lonely jail cell, no family, no friends, and most importantly, no more victims. Cox sat silently. He made no statement. He had nothing left to say. The sentence was 10 years, to run at the same time as his life sentence. It did not add a single day to his time behind bars, but it added something else, a record that named what he had done to a child who had finally been heard. Psychologists who examined Cox over the years had written in their reports that he showed no empathy toward his victims and failed to acknowledge any wrongdoing. They wrote that he would have serious difficulty refraining from sexually violent conduct if ever released. His victims were, without exception, young girls. He took no responsibility. He expressed no remorse. He was released early from his first sentence in 1985. He was released again in December 1992. 11 months later, Angie Housman was gone. Prosecutor Tim Lomar said it plainly. Had this crime happened today, it would have been solved in days. Ring doorbell cameras on every house on Wright Avenue. Interagency digital databases that share information in real time. DNA technology that does not need 25 years to mature. A system that talks to itself instead of operating in separate boxes that never compare notes. Instead, a killer lived 3 blocks from his victim's home, committed crimes behind her school, appeared on a federal list 4 years after her murder, and was never once brought in for questioning. The system did not fail in one dramatic moment. It failed quietly in 100 small gaps over many years. On December 2, 24, at 9:14 in the evening, Earl Webster Cox died at Missouri Delta Medical Center in Seexton. Natural causes. He was 67 years old. He had served 4 years of his life sentence, 4 years for 9 days of unspeakable cruelty, 4 years for 27 years of a family's open wound, 4 years for Diane's closed curtains and her porch light and the bicycle rusting in a shed and a mother who went to her grave without an answer. He is gone now. He cannot hurt anyone else. That much is true. At Booter Elementary School on Baltimore Avenue, there is a tree out front. The original memorial tree planted for Angie after her death had to be replaced. In November 2018, 25 years after she disappeared, the school planted a Shidate Yoshino weeping cherry tree in the same spot. There is a plaque beside it. The tree blooms every spring. Diane never got the answer. Ron still has the bicycle. And Angie, a 9-year-old girl who wanted nothing more than to take care of people, who looked at $500 and thought of other children first, never made it past the 4th house. She was 8 houses from her front door. She deserved to make it home. If this case made you think, leave your answer in the comments below. Do you believe Earl Cox acted alone, or do you think someone else was involved that day? If investigators had questioned Cox in 1997, when his name was already on that federal list, could Diane have gotten justice before she died? And what does this case tell us about how the system treats repeat offenders and the children who pay the price when it gets it wrong?